morning and welcome to WION. I'm Aisha Sindhu. As new details emerge about the 22-year-old Manchester attacker Salman Abedi, simultaneous questions are being raised on intelligence failures in Britain. The more damning implications suggest that Britain, in supporting foreign policy objectives in certain countries, may have provided shelter and support to the very same terrorists who are now causing havoc in Europe. Have Britain and other Western powers, by using these elements to fight quote-unquote dictatorships in countries like Libya and Iraq, fed the proverbial snake in the backyard? Well, it was an emotional day for people in Manchester today who took part in this year's Great Manchester Run, just days after the arena attack in which 22 people were killed. Tens of thousands of runners flooded the streets and observed a minute's silence to pay respects to the victims. They set off for the run under the banner Run for Manchester. Memorial services were also held at Manchester's Cathedral Church for victims of the bomb attack. Meanwhile, UK's Interior Minister Amber Rudd has said that part of Manchester bombers' network is still at large. Police continue to close in on the group behind the attack and have arrested 14 people.
It's an ongoing operation.
Meanwhile, Greater Manchester Police have released 2 CCTV images of Salman Abedi from the evening of the attack. The footage shows Abedi shortly before the suicide attack on the arena. Now, police say one of the last places that he visited was his flat, and from there he made his way to the Manchester arena. These images show Abedi in a black jacket, baseball cap, jeans and trainers. He can be seen carrying a rucksack containing the device that went off in the arena. Now, the exact location and time of these images hasn't yet been released. Now, even as more and more information is tumbling out about the real identity of Salman Abedi, the man behind the Manchester terror attack, there's now some evidence to suggest that he could have been a British intelligence asset gone wrong. Abedi could be United Kingdom's Headley. David Coleman Headley, if you remember, was behind the 26/11 Mumbai attack that killed 168 people under the nose of his CIA handlers. Now, Abedi's links with British intelligence have to be seen in the context of the UK's larger involvement with guerrilla forces fighting the Libyan regime to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. The United Kingdom had funded and supported guerrilla groups to overthrow Gaddafi. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, or the LIFG, was one of them. Here's a look at Abedi's family's Libyan connections. Now, his father, Ramadan, was an airport security officer and part of the LIFG group. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group then was a militia supporting anti-Gaddafi forces and was responsible for capturing and killing Gaddafi. Till then, the British interests were served. It was after that the tables turned. The next generation Abedi, the Manchester bomber, kept links with Rafael Hoste, an ISIS recruiter in the UK. He was killed in a Syrian drone strike in 2016. Hosi grew up just a mile away from Abedi's home. The South Manchester area was known to be an abode for many anti-Gaddafi forces with terrorist links. The men there also had connections with British intelligence. While these facts have tumbled out only recently, there are clues that suggest that the Manchester bomber had a free handing when he went to Syria and other countries where he got training. The question being asked is why British intelligence didn't stop Abedi on his travels in the run-up to the attack. He travelled extensively from Istanbul to the United Kingdom via Dusseldorf's airport. The Financial Times reported that the following in mid-April, Abedi flew from Amsterdam to Libya. Then later in May 2016, he flew from Manchester to Libya, transiting through Istanbul. According to a Berlin newspaper report, Abedi flew from Dusseldorf to Manchester May 18th, 4 days before the attack. German intelligence sources said that in spite of all the travel, he was not on any watch list. There's absolutely no explanation as to why he travelled unhindered to Syria, Turkey and Libya. Experts believe that Abedi had begun to work for forces against the regime change in Libya. The UK was the target and Abedi was the homegrown snake biting back. Now, questions like these have been raised in this section of the media, and experts are now wondering whether British Prime Minister Theresa May's anger about intelligence leaks from the US is more to do with the embarrassing revelations that may just come out. Only recently, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn linked terror to the UK's foreign policy choices.
Many experts, including professionals in our intelligence and security services, have pointed out the connections between wars that we've been involved in or supported and fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home.
We're going to get down to breaking down the implications in just a little bit. But before I go any further, I'd like you to go through what the former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had once said when terror comes back to bite the hand that feeds it. Listen in.
You can't keep snakes in your backyard and expect them only to bite your neighbors. You know, eventually those snakes are going to turn on whoever has them in the backyard.
In fact, according to the historian, British foreign policy analyst Mark Curtis, Britain has long been supporting jihadist groups. He writes, and I quote, British governments, both Labour and Conservative, have in pursuing the so-called national interest abroad colluded for decades with radical Islamic forces, including terrorist organisations. They have connived with them, worked alongside them, and sometimes trained and financed them in order to promote specific foreign policy objectives, end quote. So we've got all the information out there for you. We've talked about where the update lies as of today. We've also given you an idea of the kind of reports that have come out, not just in the British media, but also in European media, on these so-called connections between Britain and these agents who perhaps have come back to haunt the United Kingdom. Joining me on the broadcast tonight, Dr. Wael Awad, writer and political analyst, a South Asia expert. He's joining us from Italy. Joel Whittaker, security analyst, is joining us on the phone line. From Mumbai is Ujjwal Nikam. He's going to be coming on the broadcast with us in just a bit. He's a special prosecutor. But let's begin our conversation with both Dr. Awad and Joel Whittaker. Joel, I'll come to you first. We're looking at some British media reports, and they suggest that, you know, Manchester and attacks like it have some sort of link to Britain's interventionist policies in the past of using rebels or agents in, pushing for certain foreign policy objectives. Just for the benefits of our viewers, can you help us understand the process of how these agents are approached, cultivated, and what kind of funds, if any, are given or sent their way for them to carry out these objectives?
Yeah, absolutely. And for British foreign policy to be effective, it needs intelligence fed to it from the ground. It needs people who are in the country, so let's use Libya as an example, to feed real-time information to the security services of the UK. It does that in part by recruiting agents. If it can use agents that have got a tangible link to the UK, then so much the better. It means that perhaps the agent they use will remain loyal looking ahead. But it's an incredibly tough job. By the very nature of somebody who informs, by being an agent, by feeding information from your local religion, your local race, your creed, your country, from feeding that information to the UK, might suggest you've got rather a complex personality. And in fact, in order to carry it off, you would need to be able to, maybe duplicitous might be a way to put it. And so, by the very nature of an agent, it could be, even though the British government would try to get someone who they would foresee would be loyal as possible looking ahead, that's not often the case, or it's not always the case. And people have their own agendas. So the UK, in order to recruit somebody who's effective or effectively feed information to the UK security services, they will need leverage. Leverage it could be monetary reward, but tends not to be. It could be that we could assist, or the UK government could assist the agent's family in perhaps moving to the UK from, let's say, from Libya. So They're using leverage in that way.
All right, Joel, just a follow-up question to that. You're pointing out very categorically for us that there are risks involved. You've said that when you're utilizing someone for a duplicitous sort of aims, obviously there is a question mark on the person's integrity, and I'm certain that that is kept in consideration by intelligence agencies such as the MI5. We're talking about the United Kingdom's government over here. Do you feel that keeping the blowback in mind hasn't really been done effectively, and perhaps that is why we're seeing these sort of allusions being made to British intelligence failing in a case such as Abedi's?
I just think it's so incredibly tough to be able to pick somebody to feed you intelligence 1 year or 1 month and then expect that person to be totally loyal forever onwards. I think that would be an incredibly naive way to think. It would be short-term thinking. The UK, the security services of the UK, would try to put in contingencies so that perhaps they could, well, they certainly would monitor an agent's behaviour, but also the contingencies could be that if they felt that the agent was no longer working for the greater good of the security services, then they could potentially cut ties. Now, that's difficult if they've offered, let's say, nationality, residence to that agent. But it's an incredibly tough task for the intelligence agencies.
All right, Dr. Awad, if I can come across to you, do you agree that with what Joel's putting forth for us, that the decision obviously to employ an agent is a tough one to start with, but perhaps it's the short-term expectations or the short-term goals that are particularly damning, especially when we're looking at this specific case, that if we are to believe that Abedi was in fact an agent gone rogue, the implications of his utilization for a short-term goal were perhaps not fully thought through by United Kingdom?
Well, I think it's a policy has been carried out not only by Britain, but many countries. In fact, even we remember during Al-Qaeda time in Afghanistan, every intelligence in the world have sent their own people inside to infiltrate these terrorist organizations, and they were able to find out and give a good data to the respective government. But if I would see it from that angle, yes, we may be trying to justify linkage between government and terrorists or extremists who are active on the ground. But my question here is, it is a nexus between a government and the sub-centers of the ideologists of the terrorist organization that UK has kept a very good cordial relation, especially with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, where all the center of terrorists has been funding and financing and training and sending all these monies. And we know that the nexus between Tony Blair, between David Cameron, and recently Theresa May, when she went to the Gulf and saying that the security of the Gulf is the national security of Britain. So if we are to change the compass and see the direction where we should really focus in, not only on an individual, because according to British reports, which is available to us from the 2020 to 2016, right, you had terrorist organization, terrorist people are from, you had 158 from Algeria, you had 148 from Pakistan, 126 from Iraq, 77 from Afghanistan, 65 from Iran, 60 from India, 59 from Somalia, and 55 from Turkey. But if we look at the recent data, which are also available to us from 2016 to 2017, there is something called the homegrown terrorism, which is England is ignoring the fact that there is a nexus between the government of David Cameron and the Saudi Arabia, where we have seen more than 40 mosques inside UK are run by Wahhabis.
All right, Joel, I mean, I'm going to springboard off of what Dr. Awad has said, but I also want to play the devil's advocate here. Is it a tough or a tightrope walk for countries like Britain, the countries like United States, that if they don't intervene in countries such as Iraq and Libya, where there is this, supposition that there are dictatorships in place, that the people are suffering, that they'll be accused of standing by as silent spectators while these atrocities are committed. But at the same time, they're also accused of utilizing these agents in the wrong kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's global politics. It's if you use Iraq as an example, for the US, for Great Britain, not to be involved would be wrong on many levels. There is a long history now, particularly the UK, in Iraq, going back before 2003, but certainly in 2003. There's a legacy there that certainly the UK and the US feel responsible for. And so they are certainly going to have a stake in trying to secure that area. But if you look at it in a larger picture as well, the other countries that surround somewhere like Iraq, so slightly to the east, of course, you've got Iran. Countries like the UK and countries like the US, they don't particularly want countries like Iran to have too much influence in Iraq. And so you've got global politics there coming into play. And that all feeds down into a local level, which is what we're talking about now, which is intelligence. Intelligence is required to win battles, and intelligence is gained by ground truth, by intelligence from the ground, and we get that from utilising agents quite often.
Okay, stay with me, both of you. There is, of course, the question of the British elections, and perhaps we have to talk about Jeremy Corbyn's statement today and Theresa May's rejoinder to that. But before we go any further, I just want to remind our viewers that WION was, in fact, the first channel to report the fact that Manchester bombings could have had links with the UK intelligence agency. In fact, we had a report filed 4 days ago on the very same fact. Take a look.
Salman Abedi was born and raised in Manchester in 1994 to Libyan-born refugees. They had fled to the UK to escape Gaddafi's regime. He seemed a normal kid growing up and used to drink alcohol up until a year ago, according to his friends. He went to Salford University in 2014, studying business management before dropping out. His parents returned to Libya, and he made frequent trips to Tripoli, visiting his family. But it is believed from Libya he made the trip to Syria and was radicalized there. He had just returned from a 3-week trip from Libya when he attacked Manchester Arena. Police believe Abedi got bomb-making terror training in the war-torn country in preparation for this attack. Abedi fits the profile of a homegrown terrorist. They're often second-generation immigrants who struggle to integrate into society. They don't stand out from a crowd, though. That is their greatest skills, to mix seamlessly within a crowd because they understand the culture. His father is under arrest in Libya in the fast-moving investigation. He has known al-Qaeda links, but denies his son was involved in the bombing, saying, "We don't believe in killing innocents." Abedi's younger brother, Hashim, who is also arrested in Tripoli, is suspected of having ISIS connections. His older brother remains in custody in Manchester and held for questioning. It appears he may have known his brother was planning the attack. A female believed to be his sister was arrested but has now been released. The worry for security services is that Abedi was part of a wider terror network that has attacks in the late stages of planning. For police, it's a race against time to close down the terror network before it can strike again. Mandy Clark, WION, London.
All right, let's go back to our guests. Dr. Awad, Jeremy Corbyn's statements today, calling into question Britain's interventionist policies. He's been shut down by the Prime Minister Theresa May. How do you view this? How do we look at this? Is this Prime Minister May's attempt to brush the dirt under the carpet, or do we look at Jeremy Corbyn as pushing an agenda during election time? And where does this leave the conversation about calling into question the West's policies when it comes to countries outside of their own?
Well, absolutely. I would support Jeremy in his statement, because I know he is speaking facts. Like Donald Trump, before he became a president, he was talking the facts about creating chaos in the Middle East and what they have done in Iraq and in Syria and Libya and Yemen. All this has led to this kind of a backfire on them, on their own policy. And I would say that they didn't go there because there was a dictator actually to defeat or somebody else. There are 112 dictators all over the world. They went because there is oil and gas, and they have already stated this, their statement, that we have spoke of a weapon of mass destruction, which turned out to be a weapon of mass deception. So they have done that, and they have gone back home. The problem is people are not willing to address that there are homegrown terrorism, homegrown terrorists who have been either converted into Islam or have been a Muslim guy, not integrated into the society, allowed the mullahs from radical countries to go and run those mosques and promising them heaven, and that's why it is easy to recruit among the youngsters. Unless and until we address the cause of terrorism, I think we will have more people to lose. And I feel sorry for the UK. I love the place. I sympathize with the family who lost, because I am from a country where half of my family already in the street, scattered all of Europe, and I lost a couple of them in this terrorist attack in my own country, Syria. So I can feel the pain, you know. Unless and until we address. When we spoke in 1991, when the United States and the world collaborated to defeat Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait, we were asking the Prime Minister of Cyprus why they didn't come and unify Cyprus, which one was annexed by Turkey and one annexed by taken by Greece. Right. He said, we grow orange, we don't grow petrol. So let's make it clear that if you have your vested interest, which you do not want to talk about it, it's impossible that you can defeat terrorism. You have to, it will be backfire at you. You have to be, bring the blueprint of what is your policy, what is your foreign policy, what are the nexus between you and state-sponsored terrorists.
Allow me to come in. Joel, we're looking at this from the lens of has the rot set in too deep? Is Jeremy Corbyn making these statements today just part of a political ploy? Is it just lip service? But if he were to take over the reins of power in the United Kingdom, the policy is just going to remain the same, and we're going to see repeated instances of what's happened before happen once again.
Yeah, I mean, should Jeremy Corbyn actually come to power in the UK, then I can't imagine that actually foreign policy would change that much. And if we go back to your guest example, which is going into countries just solely for gain of the UK, oil and gas, well, two reasonably recent conflicts that do seem to have given us some blowback. But actually, if you look at Iraq in 2003, absolutely, I think it definitely could be argued that it was a hasty decision to go in on such on the weapons of mass destruction that were not found, certainly. But looking back is a great thing to have, and it's a luxury. But at the time, it was thought that there were weapons of mass destruction. And actually, I was there in 2003, and I remember many Iraqis in Iraq pulling down statues of the dictator Saddam Hussein. I was there in Libya in 2011. When the youth of the country rose up. That wasn't through British intelligence services, that was the youth of the Libyan country rising up against a dictator, which was Gaddafi. Right. And so I think we perhaps overstate the intelligence services, what they get up to, and the importance of them abroad. Many countries are obviously doing it themselves, and often the British intelligence agencies are there to assist in rebuilding, rather than just war profiteering.
Right. Dr. Awad, would you like to come in?
Well, I was embedded with the American troops in the war in Iraq, and I am sorry not to, I would contradict my colleague in the other side, because there was no weapon of mass destruction. I speak Arabic, and I was interrogating everybody who was under the, surrendered themselves to the British troop, which was surrendering. In fact, I was captured by the Iraqis, and I was released, and I was with the British unit there. So we understand that the situation quite well, in that we cannot justify. Come on, Tony Blair have gone to George W. Bush 2001. He agreed that we should go and invade Iraq because they had some other reason to it. Well, it was not a mistake. It was a grave disaster they have created to a country where 1 million people died. We are now witnessing what's happening in Libya is actually backfiring at the policy of UK. They want that, and even David Brown should be prosecuted and to find out what was his role in bombing Libya, because even these people whom they have supported, which is Al-Qaeda and the terrorist organization where this man, his father is belonged to, we can't justify removing a president because we believe that he was a dictator when his people themselves, they didn't revolt against him.
Dr. Awad, allow me to come in. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close the segment very soon, but before we do that, I just want to draw attention of our viewers to one fact, and that is one of the debates that has arisen from the tragedy in Manchester is definitely the failure of intelligence exchange between the two major Western powers and the closest allies, that is the United States and the United Kingdom. In fact, our senior international correspondent Padma Rao examined that very same question. Take a look.
Demonize a ruler who refuses to share crude oil or other assets, build up public support, then vanquish the tin pot dictator and win the next election. Democrat or Republican, Tory or Labour, this has been the policy that the Western world's two closest allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, have adamantly followed since World War II. The objects of desire are new, but the weapon an age-old one. Divide and rule, one that left no former British colony untouched. The Cold War era, Afghanistan under Soviet occupation in the 80s. Washington supported and armed anti-Soviet militants, even radical Islamists among them. The Soviets withdrew, US interest waned, and its earlier armed protégés were abandoned. Monster number one, the Mujahideen, was born. Then came the Taliban, and finally the umbrella Islamist terror group, the Al-Qaeda. Secular state Iraq's ruthless despot was no angel. Saddam Hussein decimated opponents. Human rights abuse, the touchstone of the West, allowed the US-UK coalition to invade. Hussein was taken out, a puppet Shiite regime put in place, and out of millions of disgruntled Sunnis, the Al-Qaeda of Iraq, which later became the Islamic State, came to life. Salman Abedi, the murderous fanatic from Libya who blew himself up and took 22 innocent lives in Manchester last week, is predominantly a product of US and UK policy. The West's interest in the North African country lay primarily in crude oil, liquid gold for the energy-starved world. It was Democrat President Barack Obama who allowed US support for groups trying to topple Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi. Abedi's father belonged to one such group. They met with chilling success. Creating rifts, taking sides, then withdrawing in indifference. These murderous monsters were born of the West, and now they've returned to haunt the West. The parents of the innocent victims of last week's terror will never be able to gaze at pictures of their loved ones without unbearable grief. But they must hold a mirror to their leaders, for it is they who have come the full murderous circle yet again. Padma Rao, WION.
Right. Dr. Awad, I played out that report because it sort of brought into perspective what you were talking about a little while earlier. But it brings me back to that very same question, that how exactly does one go about understanding the outcomes of Manchester? Does one take, who are the people who are going to take perhaps the West to task for their interventionist policies in the past that have caused this to happen, without taking cognizance also of the fact, as Joel is mentioning, there were people who were satisfied seeing Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein replaced. So where exactly does it start and where exactly does it end? I know this is a very open-ended question, but if I can ask you to weigh in.
Well, I agree with you. See, the problem with Britain that many people take full advantage of Britain's foreign policy, freedom of speech, and human rights issues where they get access and get shelter into. In fact, many of the extremist elements in the Arab world, where they have been rejected, Egyptians, Abu Hamza, and even the Lebanese, Abu Bakr, and in Syria and in Iraq, most of those mullahs and imams have got access and been nourished inside UK, and they took full advantage of the freedom and the democracy in UK, and that's why it's very difficult for a country which is respect those values and upheld it. It's very difficult for them to defeat or to counter this measure. It needs a collective measure, in fact, to fight those terror organizations within the country, among the youth, because nowadays we see a rise among the youth, not only in UK having around 1,500 fighting alongside the IS terrorist organization in Syria and Iraq, and many of them returnees are coming back into Syria, from Syria and to UK. So all these issues, I think it has to be addressed. Those missionaries, there has to be, the parents should be consulted, because if you do not punish the family of those terrorists, they will get scot-free, and they will go, but they will take revenge from their own family. They wanted to take revenge from the country which is giving shelter. I think we have to address all these issues. I feel sorry for this kind of community which is unable to integrate in such a kind of places.
Okay, so it is a cycle of violence, and it will continue to go around if nothing is done soon enough. Joel, do you think that today's conversation, for instance, is also about the way positioning of different countries has changed in the world? Perhaps the West was used to, calling the shots, the ones asking the questions, but the lens has changed now. There are people in different countries asking questions of the West now, and whether Prime Minister May disagrees or agrees with Jeremy Corbyn, for example, questions will be asked and answers will have to be given as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Jeremy Corbyn, the British government, they're all accountable for acts that they carry out, which is the inquiry into Iraq showed quite recently with Blair. But I think long term, I think terrorism, it's been around for many, many years. And since we're putting the context onto the UK with this conversation, I think the UK's pretty much used to terrorism on its home soil. If you think back, 40, 30 years ago, it was the Irish Republican Army, it was the Irish dissidents who were causing terrorist acts, and it's changed. It went through Al-Qaeda, now Daesh. It will reform again, and unfortunately, it's people that are particularly homegrown terrorism. It's people that are potentially easily picked to conduct these heinous acts, and by doing acts like that, they are themselves heinous. Of course, if you look at the Manchester bombing, it's not going to go away anytime soon, and it certainly won't go away if we don't have intelligence and an intelligence service that's effective. And so again, the intelligence service as well has to be accountable, because if it's not accountable, its mistakes that it may have made will never be pulled up, and it will continue to make the same mistakes. So I agree. I mean, absolutely, intelligence services and the UK government, and that would include Corbyn, should Labour get into power, and certainly Theresa May, should the Conservatives retain power, they should also be accountable.
Absolutely. I guess it's also important for conversations such as these to take place, to keep all of what's being learned day to day on the table and sort of dissect it in terms of the other information that's filtering in. In fact, I did bring this up a little while earlier. WION was one of the first channels to bring you this story, to bring you this connect between what people are calling this nexus of agents gone wrong for past decisions taken by Western countries. But thank you, both of you, Joel Whittaker and Dr. Wael Awad. I appreciate you both joining in on the conversation. We're going to have to close on that note, but we'll be back after this short break. News and updates, remember, carry on through the day on WION. Thanks for joining us.